Welcome to Michigan Reimagined, presented by T.A. Forsberg and Wagoner Financial. And here's your host, Chris Buck.
So I am truly blessed to have a lifestyle that allows me to travel this great state and meet fantastic people and companies. Their stories inspire me enough to host this podcast, and today's guest is an absolute perfect example of Michigan passion. Today we get to hear the story of photographer and Emmy award-winning filmmaker, Mr. Stephen McGee. Welcome to the show, Stephen.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, like me, you're not from Michigan, correct? And you've spent a lot of time traveling other places doing photography and film. Can you give us kind of a quick summary of your life before you arrived in the great state of Michigan?
Yeah, so half of my life is documenting Detroit. The other half is traveling the world. I've been about 40 countries, almost every state, for multiple different organizations, nonprofit groups, corporations. And I'm kind of a California native. I've lived in Vegas for a few years, but moved to Detroit in 2005 during a time that a lot of people were questioning that idea.
So why was that? I mean, obviously we live here and most of my listeners are Michigan based, but some aren't. And Detroit has a stigma, a reputation. People have, especially if they've never been, have an impression of Detroit. So how did your family respond when you said, or your friends or whoever, when you said, I'm going to move to Michigan? Detroit?
Yeah, well, I just traveled the world working in countries often that had incredible stories, whether it was Uganda or Rwanda 10 years after the genocide, not only those countries, but also in Southeast Asia. And at the same time, also going to some of the world's biggest ruins, like the pyramids and the Parthenon Acropolis, Angkor Wat in Cambodia. So when you combine those two things, it's really just past civilizations that didn't need buildings anymore because something had moved on. And people living in almost insurmountable challenges, but becoming the most beautiful people, that open their lives to me, that welcome me. And with a camera, like that was my access point. So when Detroit Free Press asked me to move out to Detroit, to me, there was nothing in my mind that was preventing me from going. But everybody I talked to was like, that's a horrible idea. You need to move to California to become a filmmaker. And you know what they say about Detroit. And even if I would say the word Detroit, people would almost step back and be like, oh, why? And I'm like, there's something there that needs to be navigated, that needs to be talked about. And, I just didn't let that stop me.
Huh. So when did you said you came in 2005?
Yeah.
And it sounds like Detroit really kind of spoke to you and kind of continues to speak to you. What do you attribute that to? How have you kind of identified Detroit's soul?
I think the process of becoming a filmmaker and a photographer is a lifelong process, and to really understand how you communicate to the world through a lens requires a day-to-day interaction with your subject. Detroit became my subject, became my life where I'm raising my family, and that was a large process, right? I moved as a single man 4 years after that. I got married. We started having kids. We've had 3 kids in the city. And each one of those kind of sections of my life were different sections of the city. I mean, there's been incredible growth and economic development in the past 17 years, 18 years that I've been there, from almost a 60-year bottom of disinvestment to, I think, one of the most important cities in the United States right now.
So you, if anyone follows me on LinkedIn, take a look at my most recent post. But I was reading an article in preparation for this interview, and you were quoted as saying, "To me, Detroit is the Paris of the 20s, the Berlin of the 80s, and San Francisco of the 60s. The neighborhoods teem with vibrant life. The results of billions invested into the city look stunning. The age of the abandonment narrative is over." And I love that, right? Because we get to kind of see it up close. So, but you're saying that those who are not familiar with Detroit or haven't been recently might be surprised by what they see.
Yeah, I mean, to put it in golf terms, if all you talked about was the sand traps, you'd be missing 95% of the golf, right? But if you're like, dude, it's only sand traps, it's really that's your problem because you're hitting it into the sand trap every single time.
Okay.
And so in Detroit, you might just be looking at what wasn't there anymore and associating the people with it. And when you do that, you're literally missing some of the most beautiful parts of life in a group of people that have had, a a diehard dedication to the city when every single part of life almost was taken away, from civil infrastructure to maintaining roads to, the opera to, these things that we kind of take for granted often in municipalities with great tax structures.
Right.
There's just a lot of layers to unpack that I've been able to see and document, both from just my own interests, but also working for groups like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. I did that for a couple of years, to working with these nonprofit groups that have a huge, focus, like the Kresge Foundation, the Knight Foundation. All these people see an opportunity and the people to push and progress and come alongside some people that just haven't had some things that we don't focus on.
Well, it sounds like, in order to really get, first of all, you talk about the slanted perspectives, right? So if you're just complaining about the sand traps and not looking at the beauty of the rest of the golf course, that's an ownership problem, right? And choosing the lens that you're looking at the circumstance through. The other quote, and I wasn't going to stack these right on top of each other, but you really hit it. It says, the stories written about Detroit are often saying that the city was great, died, and is now back. Or they say that Detroit is a blank canvas. Both narratives are wrong. If you come to Detroit to find blight, you will find blight. If you come to Detroit to find life, you will find life in abundance. And it's been that way. It's always that way. It's who you are and how you show up.
Dude, those are heavy words, and I labored over each one of those words.
Yeah, you did.
That was for a magazine that I was fortunate to be able to write a Detroit guide on. I'm not a guide. I'm not, I'm not an expert. There's people with much greater understanding of tax structures and that kind of stuff, but just being present, you start realizing that, like we just released a Pure Michigan film yesterday called I Am Detroit Summer. And the very first comment's like, I love Michigan, but I'm never coming to Detroit. And I'm like, how, in 2023, are we still having these conversations? Like, have you seen Roosevelt Park? Like literally a $5 million park. I think it's one of the nicest public spaces in the United States right now. You have Ford's ecosystem of content and creation and, Michigan Central Station and Book Depository with New Lab. You have these incredible efforts by Bedrock to not only rehab the buildings that so many people just left to decay, but also creating new sites like Hudson's, and Book Tower is going to be opening officially in August. And, you have these you have these icons of architecture built during a time when Detroit had more money than New York and Los Angeles combined, and we still have that city in this state. And so I think just kind of saying these things about how you show up isn't really about the buildings. It's really about just how do you, what's your perception on Detroit, and how can I, as a filmmaker and photographer, in those words, invite you into trying to understand the people there.
Right. Because you can go to, you can go to a city that maybe has, I don't know if you want to call it a more powerful brand or an immediate positive knee-jerk reaction, right? You can talk about Seattle or Austin or Nashville and kind of go into those. I'm going to go to that city on purpose, and I'm going to go right to the cool stuff, and I'm going to see all this neat stuff, and then I'm going to leave and have a reasonable experience. But, you can, if you really want to uncover a place, all of those towns that I just mentioned have really big problems, and they have areas you don't want to go into, and they have abandoned buildings and challenging times. But for some reason, we have a certain impression of those cities, but other cities that have just as cool of stuff, you maybe need to be more deliberate in where you go, or do a little bit of research ahead of time. But at the end of the day, you need to get involved and get immersed into the culture that is Detroit of the 20s, right?
There's just a lot of things I don't think that have been talked about in a healthy way that invites people into the conversation with their backgrounds. And I think that's just a general problem in society today in general, but specifically north of 8 Mile. There's 2 million white people that have moved out of the city, and their last view of the city might have been something that they've held on to. And like, there's just a lot of things that I've heard just through narratives. And I'm not saying it's just white people. I'm just saying, like, in general, like, Detroit today is an incredible place to visit, and it has been. But the leading narrative has been kind of led, I think, from what it once was, and where it's becoming based on the people that stayed. I feel like I kind of have to be careful in talking about this, but at the same time in the city, like, we're super open about talking about it. Just the people that have stayed it's really a beautiful place. And so, sorry, I'm kind of losing my train of thought.
No, it's okay. So talk a little bit about your work, right? So, I mean, clearly you were plopped in here, you did it on purpose. You got here in 2005, been wandering the streets and meeting people and doing your thing for almost 20 years. What are the deliverables? Like, what kinds of things might people find if they Google Stephen McGee, or is there a website or social handles that our listeners can maybe go to even as they're listening, or put a pin in it for later on?
Yeah. So, that's a good question. I think my work over 18 years is becoming something that I'm recognizing as an important narrative in the nation. And so I'm trying to package that into a project I'm calling Resurgo, Resurgo, which just means I rise again. It's conjugated from our city's motto. And on Instagram is probably my best place.
Yeah.
And it's on Instagram, it's my kind of global stuff is at Stephen_McGee, and my more Detroit focused stuff is at Resurgo Film. And, you know, I have a website, but it's really, like the brands that I work for kind of put it out. So, you know, working with Dan Gilbert and his crew and Bedrock, you know, Move Here, Move the World, of course, is a film still being used by people to push and promote the city's narrative, even 6 years later. But yeah, sorry, I don't have a quick answer.
No, that's fine.
I feel like I'm even like I'm just aware that like there's just so much content out there that I want whatever I do next to be like those words you read. Like, how do I make the most out of your time reading or watching or looking at whatever I'm trying to create?
Right.
You know, and that's that.
So Resurgo.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Resurgo is
still very new and fresh in my mind, even though it's like 10 years in the making.
As any creative tends to do, right? So
yeah.
Resurgo is going to be something that is not commissioned, right? I mean, this is your expression. This is going to be your art. But a lot of your other work was kind of like photography and videos are often, a company will come to you or an organization or whatever will ask you, pay you to go deliver them what you want.
So So I have about 2 million photographs over the past 18 years and thousands of hours of footage. And that's accumulated through companies and foundations. And so, you know, I did a series for Knight Foundation on small business, you know, and I work with Ford and Michigan Central as their documentarian for the whole project. And so working with their communications teams and stuff like that. But it's not really stuff that you find. And I think but each one of those has grown the narrative from just what I have access to, you know, getting content for the New York Times and seeing these like key moments. I mean, like, so the collection of that footage and that photograph to me should be a photography book, and it should be a feature documentary film and kind of Netflix series thing. And so I've kind of shopped it around to see about funding, but the funding models out there are really about ownership. And to me, this city's story just it's just a very sensitive thing to me, you know, and it's not saying that I don't want to lose ownership, but I just think that when you just say Detroit's coming back, you're just pasting over like so many stories, because it's not an either or, it's like both, right? You're like, you know, the billions of S's look great, but people have always been doing things there, even though the lenses haven't been focusing on the great things there.
Right.
So that's kind of, to me, Resurgo is going to, you know, each film I make, you know, I never really have an idea, or script or anything. It's just like a feeling inside that I try and, go out. I mean, other filmmakers think I'm crazy sometimes, but like literally, like I'll go out just with this idea and I'll just start documenting stuff, collecting some materials along the way. But even for I Am a Detroit Summer, I just went out and kind of shoot these little clips here and there to be like, we need the Historical Society because that's important. We need, Coriander on the east side because people don't know that we have a beautiful restaurant on the water on the east side of Detroit, and the Congregation, this beautiful church that someone's rehabbed, and it's got house music Thursday nights. And so each one of the visuals to me is important as like the film as a whole. So
awesome. So, and you've dropped a lot of names and stuff. So the Move Here, Move the World. That was that Amazon's HQ2? That was kind of the sizzle reel pitch.
Yep.
It was included in that to try to get their attention, which obviously they didn't come here, and maybe that's a good thing.
I kind of think it is.
But it's an inspirational 3.5 minute long Detroit pride. And like you said, it's almost 6 years old, but I find myself every now and then when I get discouraged or frustrated, I have that link on one of the pages of my just called inspiration where I need to click something to make me get fired up again. And that's to the top of my list. And I watch it every 6 months, and it's just a fantastic story.
And I thank you for that, because to me it was, again, that's a story without a script. We had almost, picture lock. Even with the shoot before that, I was working with Big Sean, and I had picture lock. I had shot everything I wanted, and I didn't know what the words were going to be. And when we reached out to Big Sean's mom, Myra, and we were like, hey, can we interview your son for this film? And she's like, that's a great idea. I was like, perfect. And, and then the next year I was like, how am I going to one up that? And then Jessica Care Moore and I had worked together, a couple years before that. She's an incredible poet and now working with Pure Michigan. And, and we just, she made the poem. We kind of tweaked it a little bit, but within 2 weeks we made a film that, I had, Dan Gilbert kind of gave me everything I needed to make this film worth it. He gave me a budget to be able to rent a Hollywood helicopter team for a day, which was insane, because I had visualized and shot almost every street in the city, but to have a $400,000 camera package on the front of a helicopter going 70 miles an hour, the amount of shots and photographs and mental images of abandoned properties in the city is so staggering that, like, what I want to do in the city and the state is to take those types of camera packages and promote, this narrative of that I think has been here, but hasn't been really to the front.
Right. Well, while we're on the topic, I want to thank one of my development sponsors here. When it comes to creating commercial and residential spaces, there's no one I trust more than my friends at the Forsberg Real Estate Company. Brent Forsberg and his team take a holistic approach to creating an environment that suits your needs while creating a foundation for a prosperous community. Since the 1950s, Forsberg has been a name to trust if you're looking to partner on a project, occupy a great space to live or work, or simply follow one of the great thought leaders in our state. Reach out to my friends at Forsberg Real Estate Company by calling 517-349-9330 or check out their website at lansingrealestate.com. You will not regret it. So, move here, move the world. I just want to say it again for those listening. If you Google that or go to YouTube and just type that in. So I was wondering about that, the narrative. I mean, the narrative coupled certainly with the video, and I think it's all video. I don't think they're static pictures. It's all just, a variety of video clips. One of the most inspirational thing, then I share that with my friends who aren't from here. Again, my wife and I are here alone. All of my relatives are in other states, East Coast, West Coast, and all of that in between. But, and you'll note I got that on the back. You mentioned Detroit's coming back. I've got Detroit Never Left sticker on the back of my phone. That's been there a long time, as you can see by how worn that is. So, I mean, how did you, I know because I've read some of your articles, but like, how did you tap in to, because it's the people, right? It kind of share a little bit about when you arrived, how you immersed yourself and walked the streets and just met people, took pictures, videos, whatever you did.
Yeah. So that's a good question, because it is about the people, but there's great humans all over the world. And it's hard to say that it's only the people that keep you in Detroit, but there's a lot of pomp and circumstance when you go to some larger cities of what you do, who you are. And I heard that Detroiters, there's no B-list actors. Everyone's on the A-list.
Okay.
And so you're just going around and nobody really wants to hear what you're thinking of doing. It's like, you know, or even what you're doing. You're just kind of doing it. Like, so if you it's almost a backwards approach to success, right? Like you're like, I'm going to be doing this, you know? And so being able to just show in the communities that I was in the circles I was in, to show up with the skill sets you have and say, you know, not how can I help fix things, because then you're saying something's broken. You know, it's like, I'm just here with the camera. How can I serve? How can I be a part of the community? Who can I partner with? And not going there to take, but going there to give.
Right.
You know, and I think that kind of mindset anywhere in the world works, but specifically in Detroit, you know, there's people with huge dreams and visions. There's New Yorkers buying blocks and being like, I'm going to build this because that's going to make, you know, but one of my interviews is like, we don't need a dog park. You know, right. Sometimes a coffee shop isn't what you need in a place. And, you know, there's fantastic artists that are like, just because you don't see an economic model of success inside of a neighborhood doesn't mean that there isn't economic models in the neighborhood. You know, if there's no coffee shop, maybe everyone goes to the house for coffee. And that kind of flow of infrastructure, small communities being successful as a community, is what to me is very beautiful in Detroit. One thing, because often in the case, sometimes communities, you know, the people you are with are because of a social club, like a golf course or a yacht club. And I'm not saying that's bad, but you don't really know your neighbor. In Detroit, like, you know your neighbors, you know your neighbors' neighbors, and that network of people is extremely strong. And that same network is why we have Motown, because Motown was built and created in the basement of a house. Techno and house music was created in the basement of a house. Two of the most large, you know, and just keep going. Like these influences are built in a community that is beautiful.
Right on. So you talked a little bit about projects that are here and in the future. Let's unpack that as we kind of start wrapping up here. So you said an episode or a new video dropped yesterday, and we're recording this in kind of the middle of July of 23. Remind us, what was that called again?
So it's once again, Jessica Caremore and I worked together on a Detroit film called I Am Detroit Summer, which visualizes her poem.
Okay.
For Pure Michigan. And
okay.
Pure Michigan was an incredible agency called MMGY, gave us complete creative freedom to do whatever we wanted to do with the Detroit film. And Move Here, Move the World, you know, it's insane. Like 6 years ago, the city was completely different. Like, and now in terms of what has been created, the social and the social investments, the economic investments, a lot of them are coming to fruition now. So the book tower's opening. So just visualizing these like incredibly busy and active streets, you know, because it was easy for years just to go down there and be like, no one's downtown. Right. But then that is like still glossing over like 6 people that I knew, you know, and although like, yeah, there was a ton of abandoned buildings, I'm not disassociating myself with that narrative at all, because I was in all those buildings. You know, I walked the Yzerman Trophy. I walked the Stanley Cup down with Steve Yzerman, surrounded by empty buildings. You know, I was on, you know, with President Barack Obama on Woodward, surrounded, you know, by empty buildings. So these things existed, but like these moments were so beautiful. And I think all of that kind of development and, you know, directions that my films are taking, and even I Am Detroit Summer, you know, kind of just starts to, I'm starting to see just how special not only Detroit is, but Michigan as a state, and how important the narrative is of further unifying Detroit with places like Elk Rapids and Traverse City and the UP. Just because, you know, I know so many people that go up north, you know, and just having that connectivity, especially in this time when a lot of the U.S. is changing. You know, I think California, like TED right now, like TED Talks. Sorry, this is kind of going to a different topic. That's okay. But TED Talks is coming to Detroit this week in front of my house. And they're coming to Detroit and Atlanta to be relevant from California. And that idea is huge. The idea is that San Francisco, you know, I've worked with some very large banks in California, kind of telling stories. And it's just insane to see kind of the same disinvestment of the 50s and 60s in Detroit happening in San Francisco. there's 66,000 vacant homes in San Francisco right now. There's only 41,000 in Detroit, but San Francisco only has 400,000 homes. And they're not like empty and broken down, but they're not also $200,000 homes. They're $5 to $50 million places.
Right.
And so when you think about like the decentralization of the Detroit auto industry over the span of about 20 years, and you're thinking now the only other industry decentralized was tech. And so the centralization of that tech industry was San Francisco. And those things aren't really being talked about. San Francisco is like extremely dangerous now, but you still think of it as like, this is a tourist haven. But something I think is happening where the West Coast is kind of losing those people, partly because of COVID work from home, partly because of access to fresh water. But I mean, you go down the list of the top 10 problems, every single answer is in Michigan. And every single answer in Michigan's biggest city is Detroit. And Detroit's still built for 3 million people and we only have 600,000. So these types of things, I'm like, my goal, I think, with Resurgo is to help fortify the narratives that have been built up over the past 60 years of disinvestment so that they aren't lost. It's also to say, hey, these things are happening across the US. I'm not like a perfectionist or understanding all of those types of narratives, but it's interesting that you look at fresh water, rising sea levels, access to land, access to, good places.
Yeah. Cost of living,
every single thing, everything, from Florida to California to Texas, every single answer is into Michigan. So
right on. So you talked about, or I was teased somewhere about Fall in Michigan.
Yes.
So what is that project as we get close?
So the second film I'm going to be doing with Jessica Caramore as a poet is for Pure Michigan.
Okay,
yeah, so
fantastic.
she's doing a poem on Fall in Michigan. So we're going to be shooting and using some available footage that I've shot before. So
got it. Okay. So yeah, the summer. I'm sorry. What was this?
We have summer. I Am a Detroit Summer. The fall one does not have a name yet.
Right.
And then of course there's 2 more seasons after that.
Yes, there are. Okay. I didn't even put that together. So I Am Detroit Summer is available now, right?
Yep.
So you can Google that or just even go right onto YouTube.
Yep.
Or,
Yeah. The YouTube, go for the 2-minute version. I really like that one.
Okay. 2-minute version of I Am Detroit Summer. Move Here, Move the World, in my opinion, is the benchmark pinnacle of your work. I mean, I don't know much about your work except for what I've learned here and research I've done, but that's fantastic.
Yeah, and each one of these are 3-minute films, right? 2 to 3 minute films. And so when I think of everything we've talked about and what I've written about over the past year, I'm like, what could we do with 2 hours? How do we, I think the story of the state and specifically Detroit is a documentary people need to see. So
right. And will Resurgo be that?
Hopefully.
Fantastic. Remind us of the handles again. How can people find
Instagram
you?
is at Stephen_McGee, and that's STEPHEN.
Yep.
And at Resurgo Film. And I don't really do Twitter, but Stephen McGee Films on LinkedIn, I think. But yeah, I appreciate it. No,
fantastic. Well, again, we've been talking to the photographer and Emmy award-winning filmmaker, Mr. Stephen McGee. I'm thrilled. I'd love to have you come back when some more of these episodes drop and more of your film is done. And I'll see you around Detroit sometime soon.
That sounds good. Thanks so much.
Thank you.